Hello, fellow Rebel Capitalists. I hope you are well. I'm here with my good friend Art Berman and research assistant Josh, the extraordinary research assistant himself. And one thing we were just talking about, of course, we're going to get to oil prices, what's going on with OPEC, OPEC plus, the Biden administration, the SPR, and maybe potentially banning experts on U.S. energy. We're going to get into all of that stuff and more. But first of all, I wanted to get Art's opinion on an observation I've made over the past few months, that it seems like people, and I think Art's the perfect guy, because Art is someone, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Art, but you would be someone that sees, as far as climate change, you see the dangers that could be out there as far as climate change. You're someone that would say, okay, this is really a problem, and we need to do something about it, because if we don't, it's going to be an even bigger problem in the future. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what to do about it, but we have to start by just acknowledging reality, okay?
Right.
And the reality is, is this something that we should worry about or isn't it? And the data tells me, yeah, we should worry about it. It's not the biggest thing we should worry about, and we shouldn't worry about who's responsible.
Right.
Shouldn't blame people, but yeah, I think it's a problem.
And I want to take this a couple steps further. Like, one of the reasons, as a scientist, you would say this is a problem is because the environment is a very intricate ecosystem, or nature, let's say. So
Right.
so there's this butterfly effect, if you will, that if you meddle with one thing, a little teeny weeny thing over here, it can have a massive impact on something all across the world, to where this ripple effect, if you will, this domino effect. And what I find interesting is that so many of the people that argue that climate change is a big problem because of these intricacies, when it comes to the economy, they're like, oh yeah, let's just hit it with a bludgeoning tool, and we'll just force it into submission.
Right.
And I'm like, wait a minute here, wait a minute. You can acknowledge a complex system over here and how fragile it is, but yet
Right.
over here, it's just as complex a system. We can go ahead and just throw in price controls and kick Russia off of SWIFT, or sanctions, or the lockdowns for COVID, and oh yeah, nothing's going to happen, no big deal, right?
Right.
That's just,
Yeah,
do you see that as well? Have you thought about that?
Oh, absolutely. And so here's my take, George. First of all, let me just say up front that, I mean, climate change is not my main thing.
Yeah,
But I'm an energy guy, and since it's not just what I believe. I think it's absolutely clear that energy underlies all life. Okay, and,
absolutely.
and as you know, I say all the time, energy is the economy. There's just no way that you can. I mean, the economy is about doing work, right? Well, where does work come from? Well, you got to get energy. You got to get up in the morning. You better eat. You better get some energy. And so you can't separate the economy from energy, nor can you separate any part of planet Earth from, like secular topics like the economy, or like oil, or like the climate. And so, to your point, um, if if we live in an environment that's trashy and toxic, then it's going to be hard to have a prosperous life and a good economy,
Right,
which is
right.
why people that care about growth and profit and things like that, which I do and you do, we're in business, for crying out loud, ought to care about the environment. It's not some separate deal. We're connected to it. And so if because of our growth as a species, we're destroying the ecosystem of the earth, that's a problem for us. I mean, that's not a problem. I mean, it's a problem obviously for, birds and insects and all of that, but I'm not asking people to, grow some compassion they don't have. I'm saying care about it for you,
Right.
because without a healthy ecosystem, we're hosed. I mean, we're hosed as a successful species. So,
Yeah, and without a successful economy,
well,
it puts you
yeah,
in the
I
exact
mean,
same position.
you can't say it's either this or it's that.
Right.
But your point, perfectly said, is if you mess with something a little bit, like you decide, for instance, oh, we're just going to stop U.S. oil exports.
Yeah,
Okay,
let's go down that path because that's something I
I
wanted to
mean,
talk about.
that sounds like an appealing idea, right? Okay, I mean, there's an energy crisis, and so why should we be sending our oil to other people? We should keep it here. It's kind of an America first. Well,
Yeah, we got to
you
fill
know,
up the SPR. It just makes sense, Art.
well, yeah, we've been draining it. We ought to fill it back up, right? I mean, so superficially, that sounds okay, right? I mean, it sounds like a reasonably good idea, except that our oil exports are part of a global system, and if we disturb the equilibrium, well, it's never an equilibrium, but let me have some poetic license. If we perturb the global system, then that comes back and bites us in the ass or somebody else in the ass, and then the whole thing gets screwed up. And the bigger issue that people don't understand, and let me be clear, when I make these kind of statements, I'm not criticizing people who don't understand. I'm just saying, hey, if you don't understand something, acknowledge that maybe you don't understand it before
Right.
you start telling other people what to do. Okay. I'm an energy guy. And if we want to talk about, some details of real estate transactions, I mean, I know a little bit about real estate, but I'm going to start off by asking you, George, a question because you know about that.
Yeah.
I'm an amateur at that. And yet, people want to tell me all the time about energy.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not criticizing their enthusiasm. I'm just saying, know of what you speak. So my point is that, so first of all, we screw things up if we mess with it. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't mess with it, but we really ought to understand what might happen. Okay. What's
Yeah,
at risk?
it's like everything we're talking about, it always goes back to doing a cost benefit analysis
It does.
and just open debate. And for whatever reason, it just doesn't
You
seem
know,
like they're doing that.
because we got it. I got my beliefs, and I don't want to give them up. But here's the deal.
Yeah,
So not all oil is the same. Shocking,
right.
right? So I mean, you go to put gas in your car or whatever it is, and you go and you accidentally put diesel in the gasoline engine. What happens to your
I've
engine?
actually done that. It's not good.
Okay, well, you're a brave man
I've done
for
the reverse.
admitting it.
I've done the reverse.
Okay, it screws up your engine, right? Yeah. Okay. If you got a car, a luxury car that only takes premium, and you put in regular unleaded, your car doesn't run very well, right?
Right.
Okay.
Or you
You
just
got to
put oil out of the ground. You could just have an oil pump in your backyard and just throw it right into your car and it's not going to go very far.
no. Well, crude oil is like that. Okay. It has different grades and different qualities, just like diesel and premium and unleaded and leaded and all of that. And it just so happens that most of the oil that's produced in the United States is of a very light quality. Okay,
Right.
it's not dense, it's not thick, it doesn't have a lot of sulfur in it, and it turns out that what America needs for its refineries is not that. We need the heavy, goopy stuff. Now, I don't want to get into why that is. That's just the way the refineries are designed. Okay, and so if we stop exporting our light oil that we can't use very much of to begin with, or not very much more than we are, to be clear, then what are you going to do with it? It's just
Right.
going to, I mean, okay, if you're a conservationist, you would say, well, saving it's not a bad thing. True enough, superficially, except that it's part of this whole world trade system. Other people use it, other people need it, and we don't send it there, then they don't have what they want, and then they have problems. And so this idea, this uninformed idea that that let's just cut out the exports of U.S. oil, that's a good idea. It's an ignorant idea. I'm
Mm.
not saying it's a bad idea. It's based on ignorance of the fact that there are different. It's like putting diesel in your gasoline engine. It's a
Yeah.
bad idea. Okay, if you make a mistake, well, okay, you get a new car, or
And,
whatever.
and and I heard another argument that one of the main reasons they're doing this is to try to get the surplus from the Gulf Coast to the other areas in the United States that need it more, such as the Northeast, But the expert that I was reading pointed out that this is a dead end street as well, because we don't have the shipping capacity to get it there, nor do we have the pipelines to actually get it to where it needs to go from the Gulf Coast, even if we could use it. But your point is, even if we could do that, we still can't use it because that's not what the United States runs on. It runs on a heavier form of crude.
Right. Now, I don't, at the risk of getting too detailed for a second, I'm not saying there are no refineries in the United States that, that use lighter crude. I'm saying that on average,
Uh,
the majority, let's just put it that way, the great majority of U.S. refineries use the heavy crude. Now, the reason that we can't get Gulf Coast oil to New England is because of something called the Jones Act, which Congress in its infinite wisdom passed, God knows when, in the 1800s, which says that only a U.S. flagged ship can move oil from U.S. port to U.S. port. And
anything, because I think that impacts Puerto Rico and the produce I used to buy.
It does. And so if it just so happens that there aren't any, U.S. licensed carriers available, well, then you can't ship it. So you can't use a British carrier. You can't use a Canadian carrier. So again, this is a case of probably well-intentioned people who thought they were doing the United States a favor by passing this law. And, maybe in the 1800s it was a good thing, but it doesn't work in a globally connected world.
Yeah, and these are the people that are the quote unquote experts and decision makers. So it's even if they don't know, it's their responsibility to talk to people like yourself that do know, so they can actually come up with a solution that's going to be beneficial when you weigh the costs and the benefits.
I'm not saying I'm the greatest expert in the world, but I've only once been called upon by a member of the U.S. government to offer advice.
Yeah.
What? In 40 years. I don't take it personally, but whatever. So
and
they got their own experts.
Why is it that the United States produces this light form of crude, but our refineries aren't set up to process it? You would think that we would want to set up refineries to actually process what we produce.
Yeah, that sure does make sense, George. But here's the problem. You can't make, what is it, silk out of a sow's ear or something, and whatever that biblical aphorism is. And so back in, let's say World War One kind of era, most oil was used to produce gasoline. I don't know what percentage, but I'm just going to throw out a number. Certainly greater than 50% and probably 90%. U.S. oil is awesome for making gasoline. Gasoline is a very light product, and you can use a light oil to make a light product. Today, the cash product of the world in petroleum is diesel. You cannot make diesel out of a light oil. Now, somebody's going to say, "Oh, yes, I know a kind." Yeah, okay, but in general, you can't if you don't have the heavy components that it takes to make diesel in the oil you're using, you can't make diesel. Okay, and that only not only goes for diesel, but it goes for a whole spectrum of other petroleum products. And so the refinery system we have now, which was basically designed 30, 35 years ago, was designed thinking, oh, well, we need to have heavy products because that's the main thing the world needs. And the U.S. is by far the biggest supplier of refined petroleum products to the world. It's a huge part of our, well, not a huge part, it's an important part of our GDP. And so in order to be competitive, we have this kind of refinery. It's just, it's that simple. Could we change? Sure, we could change, and it costs billions of dollars. And if the world was, if all of a sudden, some expert said, oh, in the future, we're only going to be using gasoline, well, yeah, sure, it would make sense to change. But the other thing that you have to think about, not you personally, but you generally, the audience, is if you want to redesign refineries, you're talking about a 30-year, multi-billion-dollar process. All right. Right now, right or wrong, most investors don't think there's 30 years of oil and gas future left in the world. I think they're wrong, but that's kind of the general sentiment. So, why in the world would you want to put billions of dollars into something that why would anybody give you the money, a bank
Mm,
included, if they share this concern that there may not be 30 years worth of economic life? And so today, some guy on Twitter was saying, "Oh, we need to reopen all of those refineries that closed during 2020 during COVID." And I wrote him back and say, "Who needs to do this? I mean, the refiners. I mean, this is a business. This isn't a public service, and nobody told those refiners to close those refineries. They did it on their own because they were old and inefficient, and they took advantage of COVID and lower demand to do what they wanted to do anyway. And
mm,
oh, by the way, refineries are not utilized to 100% right now because U.S. demand is down and world demand is down. So again, where does this instant expert come up with the idea that we need to reopen refineries? I mean, are you in the refinery business? I'm not. I wouldn't want to give refineries advice on what they ought to do because I don't know enough about it. But I know enough to know that this was their decision and they're not using their refineries to full capacity. Where did he get that idea? The news.
right.
Somebody in the news, and now it's a meme said, "Oh, well, we lost 1 million barrels a day of refining capacity during COVID, and that's the reason we got an energy crisis."
Yeah, just go over there, flip on that light switch real quick, and let's turn it back on.
Let's turn it
Art,
back on. That's not the problem.
you're saying that it's not economically viable right now. At what price of oil would it be
Hmm,
economic incentive for those
good question.
producers to start
It,
producing again?
yeah, it's not price, it's demand.
So
Okay.
is the
So,
cure for high prices no longer high prices?
well, I'm not sure that was ever true, but I mean, that's, fair enough. And so what happens is high prices affect people's willingness to buy products. And so if the problem were that refineries aren't making enough money, first of all, that's not the problem. Refinery margins have rarely ever been higher than they are right now. So the problem is decreased U.S. consumption of oil. And the U.S. economy is doing way better than a lot of the rest of the world. And we could have a long discussion about why that is the case, but just take it as a fact that is the case. And so, we've got some solution that's looking for a problem. There isn't a problem. If Americans want to use less gasoline and less diesel and less jet for whatever reason, then business has to adjust to that. We don't have to fix something that isn't necessarily broken, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think if you were to isolate it and say the problem is this, as far as the refining capacity, that one of the big things that I think you're talking about, Josh, is if these guys are looking 15 years down the road and saying, well, we're not going to be using fossil fuel anyway, or at least we're not going to be allowed to by the government, then really at any price, they're not going to go in there and drop the $30 billion because of that 30-year time horizon. It just doesn't economically make sense. So it is a weird kind of paradox that we're in right now economically. That's for sure. Art, I wanted to also get your feedback on this OPEC plus decision. And I was
Mm,
reading a thread from our good buddy Eric Townsend, and
mm,
he said anyone that says this is a 2,000 barrel cut, or excuse me, 2 million barrel a day cut,
mm,
doesn't really know what they're talking about because
correct.
OPEC plus wasn't reaching their target to begin with. So they were under their target. So they're not really reducing production, they're more reducing their target. Now, if they're saying they're going to reduce by 2 million a day, it might be a million, it might
Yeah.
be 800,000 because there
Mhm,
are a few of those producers, I think Saudi Arabia, that is producing at full capacity. So if they cut back to
mhm,
90%, then yes, you may see some cutbacks, but it's not going to be all the way down to 2 million because so many of the producers are only running at, well, they're running at full capacity, but that's still only 80% of the target. Am I getting that right? And what's your view on that?
No, you are right, George. And so currently, and for one thing, let's say these OPEC cuts that were announced yesterday don't take effect until November.
Right.
Okay, so nothing's happened yet. All right. So as of last month, OPEC was underproducing their target by 3.6 million barrels a day.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's not evenly distributed, as you mentioned. Okay. So there's certain countries, like particularly countries in West Africa, that are way under their quotas because they've got economic problems, they've got investment problems, they've got infrastructure problems. There are other countries like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, that are, maybe they're close to full capacity. And so when they say a 2 million barrel a day cut, you're right. They're probably talking about a real cut of maybe 500,000 or 750,000. Okay. And that remains to be seen. But more importantly, I mean, I don't think this has anything to do with supply and demand.
As
I
far as
think
their decision?
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think
that's where I was going next.
okay. Well, you asked me then, and I'll
No,
answer.
go ahead. To me, once I look at the, kind of peel back the layers of the onion and look beneath the surface, I'm like, well, this isn't about the price of oil. This isn't about production cuts. To me, it seems like it's just about a political middle finger to the Biden administration. but I don't know. I'd love to get your take on it.
It's certainly a political move.
Yeah.
Okay. And yeah, I mean, if we can jab Biden in the U.S. in the eye while we're doing it, then maybe that's a good thing. But here's the situation as I see it. OPEC was formed in 1960, and it was formed as basically a grievance committee of all these countries that produced a lot of oil and were unable to control the price of oil because it was then controlled by the United States because we were the biggest producer. And so as soon as they got the chance, once the U.S. oil production started to decline in the 1970s, they said, okay, here's our chance. And the first political thing that happened, which was this Arab-Israeli war, they stuck an embargo on the world. A political move. All right. And over time, OPEC has attempted to legitimize itself. Say, oh, no, we're here for the good of all people. We are, we're just trying to keep the market healthy and all that. But right now, the way I see it, and this is not a political statement, it's a realpolitik kind of thing. The world is divided into those countries that are relatively satisfied with the current world order, meaning most of North America, certainly Western Europe, former U.S. or UK Commonwealth countries, excluding a few. And then there's all these other countries, like Saudi Arabia, like most of OPEC, Venezuela, like Russia, like China, India, Turkey, who are relatively dissatisfied with the way things are. And the invasion of Ukraine, if we can set aside Ukraine impossibly for just a second, that is the arena. That's the proxy for this global reordering of the world political structure. We're going through an unofficial Yalta right now. And so if you want to know who's on the other side of us, not that we need to be on a team, but anyone who is buying oil from Russia is, by somebody's definition, on the other team. So you mentioned India, you mentioned China. Okay. Saudi Arabia and OPEC are more or less, even though they won't say it, and some people yell at me for arguing this, they're more on the other side than they are on ours. Russia's a member of OPEC Plus. Russia needs cash. What's the easiest way to get cash to Russia and poke a finger at in the West side? Raise the price of oil. Russia
Right.
gets money, and the West suffers. And let's not mistake what Russia's intent is. It's to destroy the economy of NATO. That's their intention. You know, if they can get Ukraine, well, that's great. But they're succeeding. They're succeeding on that larger objective. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not accusing Saudi Arabia of, being in some conspiracy or, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying this is the way it looks to me. And so this is a political move, and it's meant to say we're on this team.
Right. That's exactly what I thought when I first saw it, and I started to research it a little bit to understand that that's not really a production cut that's meaningful. And I think you could see that in the price, because usually if that was a meaningful cut, the price would adjust pretty much immediately, wouldn't it? We saw the price bump up a little, but not then kind of come back down. Am I not interpreting the price correctly?
No, you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Most of it was already priced in.
Yeah, and it wasn't that big of a bump. It wasn't a 2,000 a barrel a day cut bump.
No, and that's because the market knows.
Yeah.
The market knows what we've already discussed.
Yeah.
The market knows that it's kind of BS. And that
what's
it really
amazing to me is you see all the talking heads just keep repeating, oh, it's a 2,000 barrel a day or 2 million barrel a day cut. I even saw this reporter gal from CNBC that was asking questions. She was at the OPEC meeting, or one of them, just in the last couple of days, and she was really asking some questions that may have been perceived as rude. And she kept doubling down on these cuts are going to raise the prices, and you're going to be, destroying the economies of all these Western nations, and therefore shouldn't we take this as some sort of aggressive move against the West, against Europe, and against the United States? And what was just shocking to me is she was just reiterating that talking point without doing, 5 minutes of research on Google. That's how long it took me to understand, or just to look into price, for heaven's sakes. That's how long it took me to know that these production cuts weren't really that extreme.
Well, they're not. No, they're not. And let's be honest, though. They don't help anything.
Yeah, right.
Anything. They have potential to keep the price higher, or to prevent it from going lower. Where we were at before these production cuts seemed like a reality was, we were going to, $70 oil, which is good for the economy. And that's not happening anymore. Okay. This has put a higher floor under that. So it's not that OPEC has failed. It just depends on what you think their goal is.
Right.
If you think their goal is higher prices, then we don't know yet. Maybe they failed, maybe they haven't. If their goal is preventing prices from getting lower, I'd say they succeeded.
And a middle finger. Yeah.
And,
That's what I always say about Russia. People say that they're failing. And I'm no supporter of what Putin's doing, but I said, well, I don't know. It depends on what their objective is. If their objective is to go into Ukraine and wipe them out in 3 days, yes, they failed. If their objective is to try to bring together this alliance of all of these other countries that are frustrated due to the prior world order, to get people to dump the dollar, et cetera, they create inflation, create what they, pension crisis in the UK. Maybe they did okay there, but I think they've been greatly assisted by the policies of the West and the sanctions, and making it far worse for the lower class and middle class in those countries where the energy prices are spiking really high. But what do you think is going on with the Nord Stream pipeline? That's I'm very skeptical of the mainstream narrative there.
Oh, well, first of all, no one knows.
Yeah.
And I think the likelihood that we will know anytime soon is low.
Yeah.
But the way I see it, and I don't base this just on my opinion, I've got some very well placed people in U.S. and international security. The way they have explained it to me is the idea that Russia did this is pretty close to absurd.
Yeah,
I
that's the
mean,
vibe I got.
I mean, the Nord Stream pipeline is leverage for them.
Yeah.
So, regardless of how spiteful they might feel, why would you cut off your leverage? Why would you cut off a stream of revenue that all you have to do is make some deal or get some say, hey, we'll turn on the Nord Stream if.
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
well, now they can't do it. So why would they do that? I'm not saying they didn't, and I'm sure not taking sides. I'm just saying of all the countries that might have done this, I think Russia is probably the least likely to have done
Yeah, they have the least incentive to do so. I know you've been around a little bit longer than I have, Art, and one sense that I've developed, especially since 2020, is kind of a BS meter for the mainstream media,
it.
and being able to, I think, tell when they're just outright lying or maybe uh, using propaganda. And what I've seen is when they take something and they spin the truth to kind of push a narrative, I always like, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. I don't believe them. I think this is propaganda. And what I saw when the Nord Stream issue happened is a lot of the Western media, they came out and said, and a lot of the military leaders in the United States, I forgot what the one guy's name is, that said, that it's great for the United States because our imports of natural gas prices are going to skyrocket to Europe. And then there was another guy in the UK.
It was the Secretary of State who said that.
Yeah, and there was a guy in the UK, a military person, that said, well, this is obviously an attack on NATO, and therefore we need to respond accordingly, and we need to start increasing our military budget, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, wait a minute, how was Russia blowing up their own pipeline an attack on NATO? Like, it's that's what I'm talking about, as though they just say something as though it's fact, but yet it's not really true. It might have a half truth because Russia owns what, 51% of it, but it's not completely true. And whenever I see those half truths, the spidey senses tingle, and I get the propaganda vibe. And I've been right more than I've been wrong, especially since 2020. But I'd like your opinion on that because you've seen the propaganda cycle far more than I have.
Well, I mean, yeah, part of it's propaganda, and part of it is just confirmation bias that
Mm,
people want to be right. Okay, and if for whatever reason I think that Vladimir Putin is Satan incarnate and
right.
Russia is, are his minions, they're orcs or something like that, then any opportunity I get to reinforce my belief, I'll take it, right?
Yeah, great point.
And so as I look at the information and hear the explanations by people that I actually think know what they're talking about, first of all, it is it's almost as unlikely that the U.S. didn't know what was happening as it is that Russia did it.
Right, right.
I'm not saying we were an active participant, but I think we knew what was going on. All right, it's more unlikely that Sweden and Denmark didn't know what was going on. And if you look at what country, and this had to have been a country, I don't think it was some cell of terrorists or something like that. The country that has the most to gain is Poland. Poland hates Germany and Russia.
Mm.
And Poland, I mean, if the Nord Stream isn't running, then most of Europe's gas flows through Poland.
That's
So
interesting.
it is interesting. And that's not something I would have put together on my own. But again, this is what people who I trust, they don't know the answer, but they understand the context far better than I do. That's what they point out. They're not
Right.
saying Poland did it. They're just saying if you had to rank order, of the available candidates, the least likely is Russia, the most likely is Poland, and it's almost unavoidable that the U.S., Sweden, Denmark, and God knows who else were aware of it. And why haven't we heard any response from any NATO country condemning it or promoting it? I mean, Sweden said, oh, well, this was definitely sabotage.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
saw that.
it was. It was sabotage, no question about it. But nobody that I've heard in government is blaming anybody. I haven't heard the U.S. say, oh, this was Russia or oh, this was Iran. No. Why wouldn't we be saying that? I don't know. But again, you just try to piece everything together. And I'm with you, George. I think the explanations that we're hearing in the mainstream, even the less mainstream media are suspect.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the main takeaway there is for the audience. We're living through a time right now when having a healthy skepticism of what is being said in the media, all media, Russian media, Western media, Chinese media, it's a prudent play to not just take everything at face value. That's for sure.
Well, I
What?
mean, one more point on
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
I mean, skepticism has kind of a negative context to it. It sort of means, oh, you're negative. Well, I mean, the guy who originated the modern usage of that was David Hume, who was a
Mm.
philosopher historian, and
Buddy of
his
Adam Scott or
yeah
Adam Smith, sorry.
his philosophy was no, as an objective person, you should question everything. Say, okay,
Mm.
well, that sounds reasonable. Now tell me why. I'll believe you when you explain why I should believe that. And to me, that's just smart.
Yeah. I mean, it's the premise of the scientific process, isn't it?
It is. Doesn't mean we're going to be right, but let's look for support. And
Yeah.
it's hard to stay objective. It's hard for me. I
Yeah.
don't, I can't, I have biases, I have preferences. But in any case, bottom line, I completely agree with you, George, that you should always question whatever anybody else tells you unless you trust them. And I don't trust anybody that I see on television because I don't know them.
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
who pays them. I don't know why they're saying that.
Art, what's your technical view, or if you could walk us through the technical process of what would happen if the European Union set a price cap on the oil from buying from Russia? Because as a layman, this just sounds absurd. Like I would go to a gas station that was charging $4 a gallon and say, hey, I'm only going to pay you $3 a gallon. Well, they're going to tell me to pound sand and I don't get their gas. It seems to me that Russia would do the same thing, but I'm not an expert. So what's your expert analysis on that one?
My expert analysis is that, this is just some other way to try to get what you want without thinking about how it might affect the whole system. I mean, first
Right.
of all, it seems like kind of a dumb idea. Okay, your gas station example is perfect, but beyond that, I mean, obviously Janet Yellen thinks it's a genius idea. Well, you know, what does she or any of her associates know about energy? And the answer is pretty damn little, I would guess.
Yeah, but I
And
don't know that much about energy, Art, and I can still the people on the live stream. We've got 1,000 people on the live stream right now. They Janet Yellen most likely knows more or just as much, or she has access to advisors that know as much or should know a lot about this, and they know less than she does, and they can know in 2 seconds that that won't work. So it just seems to me like political theater at any price, even if that political theater or buying votes or virtue signaling or whatever you want to call it, even though that's going to make things far worse for the poor and middle class, let's just do it anyway.
it's looking at some small piece of the system. How can I use that to benefit, my agenda, my
Right.
constituency, myself, and I'm not going to worry about what other knock-on effects that has. But let's just be objective here again and say, look, Russia is one of the three top producers of crude oil and natural and refined products in the world. Okay. Maybe we think Russia is a rogue state. Maybe we think they're, a bunch of immoral, bad guys. But like it or not, if all of Russia's oil went away tomorrow, everybody in the world would be screwed. I mean,
What do you mean by screwed?
I mean, if 10 million barrels a day of oil and refined products went off the market, let's say this price cap were super successful, then the entire world transport system and economy would come to a stop.
Right.
Because it would create all kinds of supply chain problems and price spikes, and you name it. I can't.
Yeah, it'd make COVID look like a picnic as far as the supply chain.
Yeah. So for as much as we, let's say we're against Russia, and in this case, I am. I mean, my ancestors came from parts of Russia and they left because they were tired of being jerked around, tired of being persecuted. You name it. So, I mean, there's no love that I have for Russia, but, let's be honest. We need what they got. They need what we've got. It's unfortunate that we have to come to where we are right now for everybody to hold their nose and get along with everybody else so that we can all get what we need. But if we're too successful in hurting Russia, we end up hurting ourselves because back to where we started, George, energy is the economy. We hurt the flow of energy too much, and we hurt the economy, which hurts you and hurts me and hurts Josh and everybody watching the show. That doesn't mean we should turn a blind eye to what we think are illegal or immoral actions. But, let's be careful about tampering with complex systems that none of us fully understand. There are feedback loops that can cause things to happen that nobody had any idea could have happened. And then you can't undo it.
Right.
You can't just say, okay, we're done.
Yeah.
Forget that.
I mean, look at tax cuts in the UK. You do tax cuts in the UK, and now you're blowing up the pension funds. There's no way the politicians thought that one through. But
no,
for example.
But the result is that this new British government now has apparently lost trust. How do they get it back? Whether they deserve to or not, is not my issue. But they lost something because of something they did, rightly or wrongly, and you can't just say, "Oh, never mind."
Yeah.
These things have, they're all connected. So, yeah, my expert opinion is that meddling with the economy, meddling with the energy system is risky business.
Yeah.
And you ought to avoid it, particularly if you don't know enough about what might happen to know better.
Art, I was just got done reading Ray Dalio's last book, and the changing world order, something like
Yeah.
that. And yeah, he does a lot of research going back like 4,000 years, and a lot of research on reserve currencies. It was really a neat book. But one of the things that he said is throughout history, the society or civilization that is in decline is always the one that's incentivized to go to war sooner than later. And the society that's on the incline, they're the ones that are incentivized to not go to war right now and maybe push it off a couple years until they can grow a lot stronger. And as he was saying this, obviously I'm thinking China and the United States, and I'm thinking Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan, and all these things that it seems like we are doing to try to go to war. And I'm like, maybe that's it. Maybe that's our intention, is to just go now while we still have the upper hand. What do you think?
Well, I've got a lot of respect for Ray Dalio, and I thought his book was amazing also. I think that, again, back to my experts on security, what they tell me is that they think that the likelihood that the U.S. would use nuclear weapons of some sort in the current Ukraine-Russia conflict is far more likely than that Russia would use them first. And and again, I'm not endorsing their view. I'm just telling you what they tell me.
And I'm sorry, Ray, I'm sorry, Art, you're cutting out a little bit. So you said that, and the experts that in the field, it's their view that that the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, that there's a higher probability that we use them and a lower probability that Russia uses them, or vice versa?
No, you said it correctly.
Okay.
And that Russia has always been very careful and remains very careful about violating fundamental. I mean, what they did by invading Ukraine was obviously against international law, but they're really careful about not violating things that could get them destroyed. The U.S., I mean, our stated objective in this conflict, and since the 1950s, has been to destroy the Soviet Union or Russia. And our actions seem to support that.
Right.
Okay. Now, you can argue, again, I'm not saying this is right. I'm saying this is what people tell me whose profession and expertise it is to look at these things. They're a lot more worried that the U.S. will use tactical nuclear weapons than they are that Russia will. I don't know if that's right or wrong, but it kind of supports what you just described as one of Ray Dalio's themes. But that's not the way it's cast. I mean, the way that we receive the news is that China's way out of line. They're the aggressor. They're the ones that are making all these aggressive moves in the South China Sea and Taiwan. And I'm not saying that they're unaggressive, but to your point, why exactly was it necessary for Nancy Pelosi to go to Taiwan? I mean, did that help anything? I don't know.
Show me the cost benefit analysis on that one.
If I were in charge of paying for that trip, I would have said, why don't you wait a while?
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, that's not a political statement. Okay. It wasn't a well thought out thing to do. It raised the temperature. And why do you want to do that?
Yeah, exactly. Oh shoot, Josh, now I lost. Oh, there we go. I got it. I was going to pull up this article, Art, that I saw it on CNBC. I saw it on Zero Hedge as well, where the United States ordered like 240 million of these kits to combat radiation. And I'm sure I'm kind of getting the technical part wrong there, but I saw that. And then I know about a month or two ago, the New York, or I don't know whether it's New York City or the state, came out with like kind of a warning or a to-do list in case of a nuclear emergency. And
Hmm.
those are other things that don't make me feel great about the U.S. being on the defensive here, or maybe they are. I don't know. Maybe that's a good sign that we are not on the offensive and we're trying to promote peace. But it seems a little odd.
Well, I'm skeptical in the David Hume sense here, George,
Yeah,
in that look, there are a lot of things that are right and wrong in the world, and a lot of things that we should be outraged by and indignant about. Okay, but avoiding war, and particularly nuclear war, is a way higher priority than being right
yeah,
about some principle or some concept. Okay, I mean that's the way I look at it. Now, somebody's going to say, "Oh, you're just appeasing them, whoever they are, the Russians or the Chinese or whatever." But I mean, most of us live by doing work, and that means we either work for ourselves or we work for a company, and we get involved in wars, and particularly a nuclear war, and a whole lot of people are out of work for one reason or another. I mean, can you imagine trying to do business in Ukraine right now? It's just, it's just impossible. Um, and so being right often means, cutting off your left arm. And so in my view, in this particular situation where you've got two nuclear powers staring down each other, the number one thing to do is to try to diffuse the conflict.
right.
And, okay, I sure do want Ukraine to win. Okay. I mean, I don't think they're a perfect country. Actually, I think it's a pretty corrupt country. But they were the underdogs. They got invaded. They didn't ask for it. There are a lot of reasons we can talk about. Why maybe Putin felt justified. I don't care about any of those reasons. But the bottom line here, I think, is that um, I wouldn't mind making some kind of a deal if it made all this nuclear conflict, if it lowered the tension on that. I mean, I'm not making any recommendations, but if it meant, rearranging parts of Ukraine, I know some people are going to scream and say, that's not right. Well, maybe it isn't right. But what's right for the world? What's right for
Yeah,
the world is that we all are able to survive, raise our children, and run our businesses. And,
yeah. Again, it's a lack of a cost benefit analysis.
there you
I mean,
go.
and did you see? I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Elon Musk, but he came out with that tweet the other day where he said, "Hey, maybe uh, they could talk about peace," and he put like 3 or 4 bullet points that may or
Yeah.
may not have been good suggestions. But the whole point is he is like, "Okay, peace, or at least peace talks, is a step in the right direction," and he just got annihilated on Twitter for just proposing that the two sides come together and maybe just try to discuss something that isn't World War III.
Um, I, you and I get annihilated every day on Twitter for something we say, don't we?
Do you know Charles Goyat?
I don't.
He was a radio personality in Phoenix, Arizona, real popular. And he was with Clear Channel for a while.
Okay. Yeah.
And I think for a long time. And I actually had dinner with him
Huh.
in Mexico City a couple weekends ago at Andrew Henderson's Nomad Capitalist live event. And we went to one of those Benihana places, and it was me and Mark Moss and his wife and Charles and his wife, and we were talking. And Charles got into a lot of hot water when the U.S. invaded Iraq
Mm.
because he was on a conservative radio station back then.
Hmm.
in Clear Channel, one of the biggest ones in the country in Phoenix. But he's a libertarian guy, and he was not in favor of the United States invading Iraq. And he was very adamant about that. He stood by his principles no matter what. And it actually got him fired, or it put him in a position where he just had to quit. And he basically retired from radio since that time. He's done a few things with Dr. Ron Paul since then, and he's done a few podcasts and whatnot. I tried to convince him to start his own podcast because he's fantastic. But my point is, the story he was telling me sounded exactly like someone coming out today and arguing for, hey, maybe it's not a good idea for us to engage with Russia. Maybe peace is a better way out here. He got that same type of pushback and flack, and it was just really startling to see the similarities.
Yeah, well, let's take that another step further and say, well, okay, let's say that events that are going on right now, the apparent Russian disaster in Ukraine, military, let's say that tomorrow morning we wake up and find out that Putin has been deposed or killed. Let's just say. And I can imagine that there'd be a lot of people in our country celebrating that. Oh boy, the bad guy is dead. Well, have you thought about what might happen in Russia without Putin to hold it together?
Yeah, power vacuum, and now you got an Osama bin Laden running the place.
Well, there you got, and so you got, some of the guys that are in the next tier of power. There's this guy who runs Chechnya right now. I mean, he's saying, man, we need to use tactical nuclear weapons right now. And so if you think it's bad with Putin, it could be infinitely worse. What if Russia just falls apart? I'm not saying it will, but what if it did and it just turned into warring factions of people who got nuclear weapons? My God. I mean,
but to your earlier point, let's say that it falls apart and they can't export all that energy they're exporting now, or the grains, or any of the other commodities that the world is dependent upon.
Exactly. And to your dinner in Mexico City, it turns out that so the core of U.S. foreign policy since at least 1945 has been to maintain stability in the Middle East in order to ensure energy security for the United States, meaning oil. Okay, Franklin Roosevelt, we've talked about this before. He stopped on his way back home to the U.S. from Yalta to meet with the King of Saudi Arabia in 1945, when the United States produced 65% of the world's oil. Why did he do that? Because he was farsighted enough, forget his politics, to see that the U.S. would need Saudi oil in the future. And that has been the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. And so we get a bunch of yahoos, again, not a political statement, who get into the White House under George W. Bush, who say, oh man, we don't like this Saddam Hussein guy and we want to take him out. Okay, they did it. And your friend George said, no, that's a bad idea. Well, look at what it did. Aside from trillions of dollars of our money down the toilet, and hundreds of thousands at least of dead people on all sides, it completely destabilized the Middle East. Right. It allowed the rise of Iran. Iran is a much more powerful, influential country today because Iraq is gone. And so that's one of those. That's not a real butterfly effect. I mean, that's a sledgehammer kind of a deal.
Yeah.
And so for as much as I oppose Russia and the way Putin runs it, I look at, well, how would the world be if we got a worse replacement or none at all? And I think you have to look at those things. And that's the kind of system thinking that is so sadly absent among at least what I see of world leadership. Yeah. And you're asking for trouble when you think that you can solve problems that are intricately related with other things, and maybe you do solve that problem and you create 5 more. So proceed cautiously. Use the the no harm principle if you can. Think about a doctor. The doctor's job is to save a life. And just because the patient that comes in is a rapist or a murderer, his job is to save life and to let the justice system hopefully do its job afterward. And I think when it comes to world politics, I try to look at it. I'm not a doctor and I'm not a politician, but try to look at the bigger picture and say, based on what I know about my expertise, how would this affect the world's cost benefit analysis?
Yeah.
And I promise you that collapse of Russia would be a very bad thing for all of us.
Yeah, it's like the central planners. We need to have them all take the Hippocratic Oath.
Yeah.
And it's something that Thomas Sowell didn't say it in those exact words in a lot of his books, but that was something kind of a recurring message is don't just go and change something and assume that it's going to be better, because you may change it for the worse. And some things that we have in our society today, they've evolved over many, many years. And some things that we have in our human species have evolved over hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years. So let's not just go and try to change things really quick based on the fact that this may have evolved for a reason, because it's the best we got. It's not perfect, but you got to realize that we're imperfect.
It may not even be very good.
Yeah, but your choice, what the mistake people make is they think that there's a perfect solution for everything. And what they need to understand is usually there's not even a good solution. You just have to pick the one that's least bad. And people can't get their head around that.
Well, and on that point, talking about the election cycle we're in right now in the United States, and that Biden is responsible for inflation. That is just such an absolute crock.
Yeah.
If you know anything at all. I'm not a fan of Biden. Don't get me wrong, but the world is having an inflation problem.
Yeah.
And certainly the U.S. president, whoever he is not powerful enough that his policies create inflation for the world. The world is having
Trump locked down the economy before Biden was there.
Yeah, for sure. But the reason that we're having inflation is because of the cost of oil. There are other reasons too, but the underlying reason is the cost of oil increased by doubled, and that increases the cost of everything. And I've sent you a chart that shows the inflation rate and the price of oil, and the two are just an absolute lock. And everybody.
Let me try to pull that up, Art, because I wanted to put on my Jeff Snyder hat and push back on that a little bit, because I know Jeff well enough I think what he would say is, yes, you're right. It's an input cost to everything, but unless the money supply increases, you're not going to have sustained inflation across the board, because if the products with inelastic demand go up in price, people are going to have to rob Peter to pay Paul. And the money that they're taking away from something is going to decrease in demand. Therefore, those prices are going to go down. You're going to have a lot of businesses go bust, even though their input costs are increasing. You see, I think that would be his argument. So I want to pull up your chart, and then I want to kind of explore that idea, because it is, I've thought about that a lot. And, is it just an input cost, or does it have to coincide with an additional increase in the money supply so people don't have to rob Peter to pay Paul? Let me go. You emailed that to me, didn't you?
I did.
Okay, sorry guys. Let me just, my browser kind of crashed before we went live. So here, slides attached. Josh, can you see this?
Yeah.
Okay, let me pull this up here. Okay, fantastic. So is this big enough, Josh, or do I need to?
No, I'll pull it up, increase the size.
Okay, so view.
You can at the bottom too. Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a little.
Or we'll do 150. Okay, so what's the first chart you want me to stop on, Art?
That's it, right there.
Okay, cool.
So the blue line is U.S. inflation,
Okay.
and brown line is the price of oil, WTI, the U.S. benchmark oil price. And this thing goes back to 2015. I've got a version that goes back to 1950, and the two are, I mean, it's not 100% correlation, but I mean, you don't have to be a technical expert to say, wow, there's a pattern there. And so when we had the latest print on inflation, and economists were hyperventilating and saying, oh my God, we didn't expect that. We expected, I'm not an economist, and don't claim to be, but what we got as far as inflation was exactly what I would have expected. It was correlative with the price of oil. It went down a little bit, so inflation went down. To Jeff's point, and Jeff and I've had this, we've had a public discussion of this. We did in Vancouver a couple of years ago.
That's where I first met both of you.
That's exactly right. And my comment to him, and I think I was the only non-economist on that stage, my comment was, you guys don't understand what money is. I mean, you do, but you don't understand that money is nothing more than a claim on work, and work comes from energy. And so you want to talk to me about money supply, then I wanted you to tell me what has to happen to energy supply in order to increase or decrease the money supply. Because the two are, I mean, they are not the same, but they are, one is a proxy for the other. So money is a derivative of oil, of energy price. And so you want to talk to me about increasing the money supply, what you're really saying is that you want to increase the energy supply. You want to talk to me about debt. We're gonna increase the debt, and I'm telling you, well, if money is a claim on work and energy, then debt is a lien on future work or energy. So you want to create debt, then you're going to have to pay that debt back with energy resources that are not yet being produced. Do you have them or don't you? I mean, what's your net energy worth? And so to me, the argument that this chart is only the partial truth is, of course, true. I mean, I'm taking a hopelessly complex system,
Right.
and I'm reducing it to two factors, but both of them, price and inflation, involve a lot of inputs that include human behavior. And so to my way of thinking, you cannot deflect the truth of this chart by bringing in money supply, because money supply is just a derivative of oil.
But I think what they would argue is that the price of oil is a derivative of the money supply, meaning and I understand your argument with debt being a future claim on productivity, but if they are truly money printing, let's say, where they're creating more currency units, then you see what I'm saying? Because I'll bet you if we put up a chart of M2, I don't think it would go down to the degree it did in April 20, but I know at least prior to that, it would look similar, and it would look similar after April of 2020. So I'm just trying to think this through out loud here, so I'm probably getting it wrong. But what is your rebuttal there, or is it pretty much just the same argument you just made?
I guess I don't understand the argument. So state it again.
The argument is, okay, so if we increase the money supply, then you're most likely going to see the price of goods and services go up, all else being equal as far as the supply side. And those goods and services would include the price of oil. So you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. And so where economists get this wrong routinely is that they say oil or energy, whatever you want to call it, its effect is proportional to its share of the economy. Okay, so let's just throw out a number and say, well, maybe energy is 5% of GDP. Maybe. I mean,
Right.
I don't know if that's right, but it's
Right.
probably
Right.
close. Okay, so therefore, it's a relatively small factor.
No,
Well,
it's exponential.
what I would say is fine, but you're talking about price, and I'm talking about value. And
Mm,
so, if we take a barrel of oil, and you and I've had this conversation before,
yep.
and we compute how many joules or calories of work energy is in a barrel of oil, and convert that into a man day or a man year, we find out that a barrel of oil has roughly 4.5 or 5 years of work in it, human work.
Yep.
And if you say that the median income of the United States is $44,000, or the average, I don't know which it is, let's say it's around there, then a barrel of oil, the value we get from a barrel of oil is $198,000 a barrel.
Mm,
So its effect on money and the economy and productivity is so completely in contrast to its share of GDP that you just can't dismiss it that way. And
yeah.
so
Right.
take it a step further and take those same calculations and say, well, how much oil, how much energy, how much fossil energy, oil, coal, natural gas, does the world use in a year? And it's roughly 100 billion barrels of oil equivalent. That means that we have got something like 500 billion fossil energy slaves working for the world all the time. We got 8 billion people in the world, and we've got 400 billion fossil energy slaves working. Now, when you start thinking about it like that, I'm going to say your M1, M2, M3 is a rounding error.
Yeah. Right. It's just, yeah. Yeah. It's just a unit of measurement. It doesn't really, it's not, doesn't really hold an economic value, maybe. Although I guess you could say, uh, if you increase the money supply in a in a hazardous way, a dangerous way, that it could impact even the exploration of the energy we need to be productive. I'm just thinking, like, if the whole world went through a Weimar Germany,
I,
like a hyperinflation, then
I,
productivity, you can't even,
I'm
go ahead.
I'm in no way saying that money supply and interest rates and I'm not saying that that is unimportant. I'm not
Right.
saying that at all. It's critically important, obviously. All I'm saying is, let's start with first principles. What comes
Yeah.
from what, and
Yeah. Right.
it all comes from energy at the end of the day.
Art,
So
uh,
yeah.
in my space, there's a lot of people that look to nuclear energy as a solution to the problems, a lot of the problems we have today. But I know on Twitter you've said, "Whoa, time out here, guys. This might not be a panacea." And I've talked about being very bullish long term on uranium. People who ask me about what I like to invest in or what my thoughts are. So I'd love to get your ideas. Why is nuclear energy not a panacea?
Okay. Um, Nuclear energy has one use, and that
What's
is generating electric power.
right, right, right.
Electric power is 18% of the world's energy consumption. So it very well may be that nuclear energy, nuclear power, is a critical element going forward for electric power generation. Let's
Mm,
just, let me be parabolic and say it's the second coming. It's the only way that electric power generation lives and moves forward. Okay, you're solving a small part of a bigger problem, and the bigger problem is the 82%.
yeah.
The 82% is all the ships and the trains and and the trucks and the the non-electrical manufacturing, the mining, all of which, you can't build a nuclear plant unless you can mine the uranium. And if you can't transport the uranium by ship, by the way, to some
Right.
place where it can be processed and it can be, put in, you get the point. It's just not that simple. So I would say that for Europe and its electric power problems going forward, nuclear is critical because nuclear is baseload. And Europe has problem in that it's overweight on renewables and it doesn't have enough to keep the plants going when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. That's a real unfortunate situation they've got themselves into, and I don't want to argue, whether it was stupid or it just is. Okay, so for Europe, nuclear makes a lot of sense
Right.
because they got to figure out some way of supporting their electric power grid. But still, it's a relatively smaller proportion of Europe's overall energy problem. For a
Yeah.
country like the U.S., I mean, we got tons of gas. Why in the world we want to get into the environmental risk and the cost and all of that of nuclear plants when we got so much gas, we're sending it overseas. And somebody's going to say, oh, well, gas isn't clean and blah, 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 blah. Well, guess what? Spent uranium waste is not exactly clean either. But to your point, George, I mean, uranium might be a terrific investment. It
It's just
probably
not
is.
a panacea.
Nuclear is not. It's another one of these solutions in search of a problem. If you're talking about the world now, just for fun, I mean, can you imagine what we're talking about for nuclear power in, say, sub-Saharan Africa?
Mm.
I mean, can you even imagine when that might happen and what that might look like? I can't.
Well, I'm in the middle of Colombia right now in Medellin, which is a very modern city, but
Right?
still, even here,
It's
it'd be an
way
uphill
off
climb.
in the future. I mean, there's so many problems. People, again, they want that bright, shiny thing that seems to solve all of their problems.
Yeah.
And how do they know about that? Because some talking head told them about it. And somebody else said, oh, yeah, I agree. And I mean, I get crucified regularly on Twitter because I have the audacity to speak heresies about nuclear energy. And
Yeah.
I'm not against nuclear energy. I'm just trying to give people the information.
Yeah.
I'm all for nuclear energy. I think it's risky. It's got some problems, but I'm not against it. I'm not against renewable. I'm not against oil. I'll tell you all the problems with oil too.
Yeah.
I mean, everything's got problems, but you got to start by understanding what it is we're dealing with. What's the terrain look like? You have a map? I mean, we don't just want to go running out into the wilderness and say, I'm great. I'm going to solve the problem. I mean, we'll probably die.
Yeah, yeah. And as a fellow rebel capitalist, because
Right.
Art's got his rebel capitalist T-shirt on, there you go. First and foremost, we got to find the truth of what's going on here, and then we got
Or
to do a
should we
cost-benefit
understand?
analysis. Let me try to at least do one news story where I was going to try to do like 10 of them, but
Uh-oh.
let's. I don't know if you saw this. Art, Josh, can you flip me over to CNBC here?
Yeah, can you just increase the size?
Yeah. So this is a headline that came out today that GE is laying off 20% of its workforce in their onshore wind power division.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, it's because it's not economically feasible. So I wanted to get your view on this and then also try to think through if we are to believe the yield curve, we're probably going to have a pretty significant recession, global
Mm-hmm.
recession in the near future. Let's say if we're not in one right now, in which case the companies, these big corporations, are going to be pulling back on capex. And so how is that going to affect the energy landscape, I guess is my question. But my guess is you're probably not surprised by this headline.
No, it's I mean, all of these companies are have have carved out a piece of their budget, a relatively small percentage, but if you're a big company, it's a lot of dollars to pursue high risk, and I say high risk in terms of capital return kind of projects, and wind and solar and hydrogen, and you could probably think of a few more are in that category. And so those are things that they're money losers today, and they'll probably be money losers for some time in the future. But there may be advances or circumstances that make them money makers in the future. And so that's the way big companies balance their budget, right? It makes sense.
Why are they money losers today, Art? Like why
Because
aren't they
it's super low
profitable?
productivity. First of all, I mean, wind is expensive, um, and I'm sure everybody watching this interview discussion has heard that wind and solar are by far the cheapest forms of energy, right? I mean, somebody on CNBC said it, so it must be true. Well, on a point forward basis, that is true. In other words, once you've paid for for all of the investments and you've got the wind turbine up and running, yeah, that's true. But that's not the way we figure cost benefit, is it?
Right. Right. Total
Right?
cost, not just the
Yeah,
cost you want to
total
acknowledge.
cost. The other problem with renewables, other than the fact that they're intermittent, and that's another problem altogether, is that um, they're low productivity. And so if we try to take a look at you know how many wind turbines it takes to equal the input from, let's say,
Barrel of
natural gas
oil.
or
Yeah.
coal or something else. And the way that power plants do this is they've got this measure called power density. And I think I showed a slide last June in Miami to this effect. The power density just says, you bring me some form of energy, whatever it is, and it comes into my facility and it takes up a certain amount of space, square foot or cubic square meter kind of space. So how much power can I draw from that surface area? And if you think about it in terms of workers, okay, so let's say a natural gas worker is the way. I mean, if you're a power plant, you got to hire some people. Do you want to hire one worker, 10 workers, or 100 workers? Well, you'd rather hire one really productive worker as opposed to 100 less productive workers. Well, in terms of of natural gas as a worker standard, wind is it takes about 1,000 wind workers to equal one natural gas worker. So
Right.
would you rather have one guy working in your plant or 1,000 guys? They both produce the same amount of power. Well,
Yeah.
you'd rather have one guy. And that's the
And
problem. You
isn't there
cannot compete. You cannot compete with fossil energy for energy content per unit volume or area. It's not a bias that I have. It's a fact of physics. Can't do it.
right? And isn't there another metric where they measure the input of energy required to
Yes.
get a specific output? So people don't understand that if you get one barrel of oil, let's say, it actually takes energy to get that barrel of oil. So you want the highest ratio possible. For one input of energy here, you want 100, 1,000 output energy
Right.
units coming out the other side. And even with solar and wind, there is still an input of energy to get a specific output. And I think
Right.
I'm saying the same thing you just said, but there's another metric there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's called net energy or energy return on investment.
There you go. Yep, that's it. There
And
you go.
so if you look at, and these are, these are a little bit squishy, these numbers, okay? And so I look at them notionally, but the if you compare, let's say, wind, okay, wind has something like you put 1 unit in and you get 5 units out. Okay, that's not really great, but it's okay.
Yeah.
With oil, it's something like you put 1 unit in and you get 35 units out. Solar is, maybe you put 1 unit in, you get 3 units out. Coal is somewhere, in between. And so, I mean, those are and again, I don't want anybody to, write down those numbers and say those are the truth according to art. But those are, but from a proportional standpoint, that's probably about right. And
Yeah.
so what that's saying is sort of the same thing I was just saying with the natural gas workers versus the wind workers, is that there's a huge gap between what you can get from fossil energy versus renewable energy. And
Yeah.
it's not it's not a criticism. It's just a fact. And there's going to be somebody watching us today saying, "Oh yeah, but somebody's gonna find some new technology that changes all that." Well, maybe not, but the reality is that if you care at all about the ecosystem of the earth or the climate or any of those things, we don't have 100 years to figure that out. I mean, if it's not feasible today, at least on some level, it's probably not part of that solution. Doesn't mean we should stop working on it. And the other thing too, I think that the technology is another one of those shiny things that oh well, somebody will figure this out. Well, man, I don't want to bet my portfolio on that. I want to see some kind of a graph and some kind of numbers. And again, maybe I'll put 5% of my money into something that's a what if and a maybe, and if it hits, fantastic. But I don't want to bet my family's future on that. So
Yeah.
that's the problem. It's not a criticism of wind. It's just it's not a very productive form of energy.
Yeah. The good
Somebody should
news,
agree with
I'll say the good news here to conclude is that throughout history, that is one thing that human beings have done well. We've
that.
criticized a lot of human beings today, mostly the central planners and authoritarians and political leaders. But
Yep.
for the rest of us, the average Joes and Janes, uh, throughout history, we've been able to solve some pretty complex problems. I remember one example that I heard my good buddy Simon Black talk about is when we went from the Bronze Age to, I don't know what the next, but
Iron
they
Age,
they discovered tin, or no, they needed tin as an
right?
input to bronze, and it was pretty much the same thing, that they're running out of tin. It's like we're at peak tin. We're not going to have it for that much longer,
Mhm.
and it was a very similar type of argument to what we have today. Obviously, a lot less impactful, probably on the planet and whatnot, but it was the same type of. And then they came out with iron, to your point, and we as a society, as a population, we figured out a solution. So I'm like you, I don't like angel investing, so I wouldn't want to bet my whole portfolio on it. But it does give me room for optimism that if the human race is able to do what it does best, if we're not shackled to such a great degree by the central planners, then I'm pretty hopeful that we'll figure out a solution.
And I agree with that, George. And I would add only that in the case of an energy crisis, probably the worst thing you do is support those prices with subsidies.
Or suppress those prices. Yeah, exactly. You need
You
to
know,
have prices increase to naturally let the price mechanism work to decrease demand.
I don't want anybody to starve or freeze in the dark or anything like that. I mean, you have to approach it in a measured way. But you know, to to draw down our national strategic petroleum reserve so that Americans can pay 50 cents less per gallon for gasoline. That's not a good. I mean, okay, you want to win the election, I get it, all right, but I mean that by making gasoline cheaper, all that does is cause people to use it more, and
Yeah.
so before very long, you're right back to the problem you had to begin with, right?
Yeah, we're just digging ourselves in a deeper hole.
Exactly.
All right, buddy. Well, I've kept you now for pretty much an hour and a half. Thank you very much. You probably thought this was going to be like a 15-minute interview. So
We've never had a 15-minute conversation.
I know. Next time when I DM you on Twitter, think twice about saying yes.
I always enjoy these conversations with you, and hopefully some other people that are watching have too.
Oh yeah, we still have over 1,000 people. We've pretty much had 1,000 people or more this entire conversation, Art.
Wow.
So people are really engaged, and I think I can speak for everyone in the chat right now that they're very grateful and appreciative of your time and your expertise.
Well, I'm grateful for their attention and look forward to talking to you again soon.
All right.